I have so much to talk to you about. Kevin, of course, co-founded the company, sold it to Facebook for $1 billion when you had just 13 employees.
It was 11, and we hired 2 people in the ensuing months, but yes.
Thank you.
I need that average down, yeah.
We'll take the correction. We'll take the correction. You know, when I said I wanted to talk to you, I didn't realize, actually, that we were going to be preceded by the Kardashians. And one of the things I'd love to talk to you about, given the conversation we just had with them, actually, is this idea, and I want to get into technology and advertising and the politics of what's happening right now, but you know, they raised, and Leslie Stahl raised some really interesting issues about mental health and social media, and I know that's something you spent a lot of time thinking about, especially in this past year, and I know towards the end of your leadership of Instagram, it was a topic du jour for you. But sort of now, a year later, when you think about it all, what's your latest thought in terms of the mental health issue and what needs to happen or what needs to change about social media?
Why don't I take this in 2 parts? First, I think, is the Instagram part. The good news is that our goal was to build an organization that prioritized the well-being of our community above any business metric, and that still exists today. I know that Adam, running the company, cares deeply about this. I know that the management team cares deeply about this. Some of the projects that we started, hadn't launched, were launched after we left, and it shows their commitment to the idea that you can create a platform that cares deeply about people. You might ask why. There are 2 parts to this. One is that I believe that the only way you can create a long-term business in social media online is to create the most solid community. One of our investors used to say, anyone can create a photo sharing app, not everyone can create a community. So you ask yourself, what's the best way to make a defensible asset there? And it's to make sure that the community stays healthy. So that's why we invested so much in it. But also, as a new father, my daughter's 2, I'm having another kid. I should say my wife's having another kid in 3 weeks, but we are having a kid together in 3 weeks. And you ask yourself, when you create something, you know, we never set out to change the world. We set out to make something we wanted. And then all of a sudden, 1 billion people were using it. What kind of legacy do you want to leave in that business? And for me, you know, you can make a lot of money, you can, you know, have a lot of installs, but like, did you move the world forward in some way? And the idea that we would work on bullying, which was in your panel earlier with the Kardashians, I mean, we created an artificial intelligence layer that looked for bullying and filtered it out. We actively went after some of the world's hardest problems in social media today. So you asked me maybe what my highest level thought on this is. It's going to be one of the major challenges of that industry for a very long time. And the problem is that the people running these industries, like me, you know, you're 35 or 40, you really need to be in touch with what it's like to be a young person online today because they use it differently. And if you're not in touch and if you're not proactive about that problem, it can get away from you. And you don't want it to be too late. But I think when I look at what companies are doing today in this space, I'm proud of what we started, and I'm proud that they continue.
Okay, but now I'm going to make it hard for you.
Go.
And I just want to read you something. This is according to the Royal Society for Public Health in the UK. You probably know where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
They say that Instagram was found to have the most negative overall effect on young people's mental health. The popular photo sharing app negatively impacts body image and sleep. It increases bullying and FOMO, that's fear of missing out, and leads to greater feelings of anxiety, depression, and loneliness. The positive effects of Instagram include self-expression, self-identity, community building, and emotional support. So there's a good side to it. But how, from a tools perspective or from a technology perspective, how do you change the dynamic? And how do you change the business? I don't know if it's a change of the business model. I don't know what you, or maybe you think this is just society.
There's a lot wrapped up in that. First, I'll say, while I take the criticism and I hear it, I think that particular article, I think, stretches the truth a little bit. Now, that being said, I think anyone agrees, if you talk to any 13, 14, 15-year-old, there's bullying online. There are body image issues. The list goes on. So none of that is untrue. I just think that the truth of the matter is that, yes, social media reflects society, usually not the other way around. And what you need to do if you're leading one of these companies is lean into the fact that you have this problem, that you can be the person to move the world forward in some way on it, and attack it with your best technologists. And that's what we tried to do. I'm not saying we made a ton of progress. I'm not saying that we solved it. But a world without Instagram, I think, is a sadder world because of all the positive effects it brings families, all the other list of
Right.
qualities that you just listed off. And there's not a single technology in the world that doesn't have both sides to it. There's no technology that's pure good. And what you have to do as a leader, if you control one of these things, is figure out how to emphasize the good and solve the bad. That's what we tried to do.
Okay, but on that note, there was a story in Wired magazine called Instagram's Kevin Systrom wants to clean up the internet. And I want to know what that means, to clean up the internet. Meaning, if you were the czar of the internet, what would you do? How would you change all of these things? Would you remove, there's filters now, beauty filters. I don't know how you feel about beauty filters on by the way, it's now on Insta, it started on Snap. Are those good things? Are they bad things? I want to get into the political question in terms of free speech and what people say to each other. I mean, where are you in this sort of filtering versus non-filtering?
Well, I mean, Instagram was built on the idea that you would take an image and make it look
filter
better than it was. But we didn't quite go to the logical extreme that you're talking about. So, okay, first off, cleaning up the internet. There are a bunch of different problems on the internet, so you got to pick and choose so you can go deep on one of them. We picked bullying, and there are others that pick other important issues. Now, you can't do it all at once, but you got to push on it, and you got to apply technology to it, and that's what we tried to do. In terms of filtering and representation of physical appearance, that's a really tough issue that I think we wrestled with at Instagram for a while. Should you present yourself as you are, or should you let someone, quote unquote, improve, how you look? That's a tough question, especially when a lot of young people use your product and are looking to your product for how they should feel about themselves. I think the momentum inside that organization now, I believe, is towards a world where more honest representations of your life are better. We started in a world where you could only post on Instagram feed once a day, and it had to be that amazing moment that you wanted to share with everyone. And what we realized that actually it was better for our business if we launched stories and we let you post all you want about all the unfiltered things throughout your day. So I think there's actually a movement within an Instagram to be a bigger business within perfection. And I think that's a good thing for the business in the long run.
Let's talk about free speech, because one of the things that I've always found so interesting about some of the conversations we've had and what you've tried to do with Instagram is you were very happy to ultimately filter out bullying, to filter out things that maybe didn't have a quote-unquote positive message, right? And so here we are in this unique time in society where there's a debate taking place around this country, around Silicon Valley, around Facebook itself, in terms of what to do about free speech online, and specifically in the political arena, and specifically in the paid advertising piece of it. And so my question to you is, if you were still at Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg was sitting with us right now, would you say, I agree with how you're approaching this, I disagree with how you're approaching this? What would you do?
I'm not going to answer that question. But what I will say is that I think every single day these platforms make judgment calls. So whether it is pornography or hate speech or name the type of content, there are decisions that get made about whether or not to allow it to exist on the platform. So the idea that everything is allowed and that there's no judgment call and that we're not going to make a decision on this stuff because we shouldn't make judgment calls. We made judgment calls every single day. And you feel comfortable making those judgment calls when you feel like there's a lot of societal support for those judgment calls. It's pretty clear that most people in the United States believe there shouldn't be pornography on something like Facebook or Instagram, so you can make that and no one says anything. Now, when it comes to political free speech, misrepresentation of facts, or maybe that's a euphemism for lying, is that allowed or not? And I think that's probably a place where, and again, I don't know what's happening inside of Facebook now.
By the way, we can take this out of Facebook if you want, just so we can talk about it at least maybe hypothetically, so you can answer the question. But think about it in the context of a Google, or think about it in the context of a Snap, or think about it in the context of anybody else who's thinking through what should really happen.
But I think my answer was trying to be clear that the problem is there societal support for making a decision a specific way, because it happens every day in a bunch of other categories.
Right.
And it's unclear to me why people in general don't feel like there's societal support to say you're not allowed to lie, especially when it involves an election, and especially when people use your platform to get their information. But I'm not these people, these multiple companies you just named.
Right.
So I think what you have to do is push on it and see where it goes. But I think there's also this balance of being principled or pragmatic. And I think you can choose to be principled, but that comes with all the side effects that you're seeing today. I think people get very unhappy if they disagree. One of the keys to greatness in life, I've been told, is to be contrarian and to be right. I think they checked one box, and the question is, are they going to check the other box? And I think we will see. Time will tell.
So, talking about being principled, and maybe you think Facebook's being principled. I was going to juxtapose what Facebook's doing, obviously, with what Jack Dorsey is doing at Twitter. Both think that they're principled, right? But my question to you from because you think about technology, is there actually, so Jack Dorsey's effectively said, look, there is no way to police this stuff, so we're just getting out of the business.
Right.
And on the other end of it, I think to some degree, Mark is saying, there's no way to police this stuff, so we're just not going to. And so my question is there some place in the middle, knowing what you know about how these systems work?
I think there has to be some place in the middle. I think it is, I think politicians should be able to reach people with their message, and I think turning that off, that turns off a lot of opportunity for a lot of really good candidates to reach people in the long run. That doesn't seem to me the direction that I personally would take, but I don't have all the context inside of Twitter, so I'm not him, and I don't quite understand why that decision was made that way. But there has to be something in the middle. But to go to the other logical extreme and say it's unpoliceable, we're not going to do it, I think isn't the right place to end. And I think, I don't know, if you polled this room, how many people agree with that? I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a ton of people that believe that's the right logical answer as well in the long run. And maybe what we're doing here is we're calibrating as society exactly where we want to be. And regardless of the current opinions of these two companies or any individual, through this process, I think we will find a way to find the right answer. And the question is just how painful is it to get there?
Let me ask you a different question, and it has to do with a shift in the way the entire internet is moving, which is to say that when you started doing this, privacy was nothing. The whole idea was nobody wanted to be private. Everybody was sort of open kimono everywhere.
I don't know that I agree with that, by the way. I think Instagram was one of the first social networks to say everything is open. I mean, we only succeeded at the beginning. I shouldn't say only. One of the major reasons we succeeded was because all photos were basically private. I mean, Flickr was basically closed off. Facebook, it was friends only. Instagram was the first one to be like, if you post a photo, by default, this is going to be open. And I think that's partially why it took off so quickly. But I understand that it might feel that way. I just see it slightly different.
Okay, let me shift it then to a different issue, but relates to privacy. How do you feel about encryption? The idea of end-to-end encryption, because that is the way both Facebook's moving, but by the way, Google's, everybody, Apple, everybody's moving towards end-to-end encryption when it comes to security. And some people say this is fabulous because it's going to protect all of us and our images from being stolen by hackers. But at the same time, it's going to make it a lot easier for the bad guys to do really bad stuff.
Right. So first of all, I think encryption is a beautiful thing for a lot of reasons, but it presents the challenge, the trade-off that I think you've heard time and time again. This isn't new. It's, okay, and by the way, no one's worried about public images being stolen. They're worried about messages being stolen or introspected in some way. If you and I want to have a private conversation, is it okay if there's even a possibility that someone can look in on that? Because if you leave a door even slightly ajar, someday someone's going to use that opening nefariously. And if you make the principled decision to close that, you end up with the consequence that no one can look in, including people with good, quote-unquote, good intentions that want to protect, say, a country. And I think that is the fundamental trade-off that no one has yet solved. I don't have a solution for it. But like everything in the world, the best decisions in life are not the ones with no negative effects. They're the ones with the least negative effects. And I think society has to decide where they want to be on that gamut. And you have to vote with your footsteps in terms of what products you use. And you also have to vote. So like, that's the way we come to a conclusion on both of these issues.
Let me ask you a different question. We spent the morning with Makin Delrahim here from the Department of Justice. I don't know if Paul's still here from the FTC as well. And we talked about this big idea about breaking up big tech and whether, and Chris Hughes is here as well, this idea of whether that would solve some of these issues that we're talking about, whether it be your privacy, whether it be some of these issues around free speech or how political. Do you think that breaking up these companies one way or the other would actually change this dynamic?
At heart, I like to think of myself as a problem solver. Like if we're gonna work on something at Instagram or whatever I work on next, it should solve a problem in the world, a specific problem, and you should know how your action has a specific effect that solves the problem you identified. My fear is that a platform of breaking up big tech prescribes a very general medicine to potentially very specific and very different strains of an issue. And that generally doesn't end well. And I think if we're going to attack specific problems, say if you don't believe someone, like Chris Hughes doesn't necessarily believe that someone should have so much power to make policy decisions unilaterally, okay, go after that specifically, but don't think that just by, I don't know, peeling off WhatsApp and Instagram that all of a sudden solves that problem, because you still have 2.5-ish billion people on Facebook, right? So I don't have the answer, but I do have a framework, which is if we're gonna do these massive shifts to these large companies, it should be in the name of solving a very specific problem, and you should be able to tie it back to, I know if I take this action, it's gonna solve this problem, because I think we all deserve that if we're gonna take that type of action. It's a tough one.
Okay, let me ask you a different question, and we talked about it with Paul and Makin real briefly this morning, and this relates to the antitrust sort of larger theory in life right now, which is whether big tech companies should be able to buy little tech companies. And the reason I ask is because there was a time when Instagram was a little tech company, and it was not clear at that time that Instagram would be necessarily a competitive threat, full stop, to Facebook. Maybe they thought that it would be. But how you think today, if you were an Apple or a Google just bought Fitbit, for example. They're not really in the, they're in some of the wearable space. You wouldn't think that they're the leader. But if 5 years from now we find out that Fitbit turns out to be, overtaking Apple Watch and has a monopoly on the business, how do you think we should think about that? And as an entrepreneur, do you think that selling to these companies makes sense anymore, given what's happening in the world?
I think there are two principles to use to look at this. One is how capitalism just works. I think if big companies weren't allowed to buy little companies, I think you'd get a bunch of innovation that wouldn't end up taking off. There are plenty of examples where companies, I think YouTube's actually a pretty good example, where they were, bleeding cash. It was enormously expensive to run, but because they were under the umbrella of Google and Google had this enormously successful business, they could figure out how to give it enough runway to grow and thrive, and now it's one of the main ways that people consume video content online. That I think personally, consumers are better off because of that. And there are plenty of examples. I think Oculus is another one. Like, it's a very new technology that needs a very long runway and needs someone who believes in it to make it a reality. So to make innovation work, you need to be able to buy companies. Now, I think as a founder, there's this other principle, which is it's so easy to judge a decision in retrospect and say, was it good or was it bad? And as an investor myself, that is like the one thing you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to look back and judge based on the outcome. You have to judge based on the information you had at the time. And in Instagram, our company, there were fewer people than are in this front row today. Right. And we had 20, 30, 40 million people or something registered, and it was growing, but who knew what it would become? And I think, rightfully so, Facebook poured a tremendous amount of resources into it and helped a ton. And we worked our tails off and stayed long past whatever founders would usually stay in a company to make magic happen. And I'm so proud of what we created. But to look back and say, oh, that shouldn't have been allowed because they worked so hard on it eventually, I don't follow that logic.
So Steve Anderson, who helped stake you with $250,000 early on, says, I advised against selling. Was he right or wrong now?
Oh, it's so easy to say what you advised in retrospect. So, oh, Midas list, I guess. I think, so was he right or was he wrong was the question?
If you could do it again.
I think I'll just go back to my other principle, which is like, you don't know. Like, when someone comes to you and offers $1 billion for 11 people, what do you say?
I've got a couple more questions, let me ask
we're moving on.
Let me ask you this. One of the social networks or social media companies that's now in the news a lot is something that I didn't even really compete with you probably a year or two ago, which is TikTok. And there are big national security questions about that company, given that it is owned in large part by the Chinese government, or the Chinese, and there's a view that the government is using that information. Some of it, by the way, is owned actually by US venture capitalists, oddly enough. What do you make of TikTok?
What do I make of it? It's not exactly targeted at my demographic, but so actually let's talk about the dynamic of who owns it and whether or not we should be worried about that, right? The Chinese have had this thesis for a very long time, which is why Instagram doesn't exist in China. It's why LinkedIn had a ton of trouble opening up anything there. It's why Twitter doesn't exist. It's why Facebook doesn't exist. I think they get this risk, and that's why they've always had this policy. It's just not up until now. You haven't had a Chinese version of a social network take off in the US, and we're now dealing with that. And in retrospect, it shouldn't actually have been a surprise. But now we are facing a question of whether or not we want to go the route of, like the Chinese have, of saying no, not here, or whether we want to promote an open and free internet where anyone can compete, which is typically the way we've approached this problem in the past. And I don't have a good answer for that, but I understand why they're currently thinking about it and looking hard at it.
What would you do?
What would I do? I'm not sure. For me to be able to answer that question, I'd have to be way more in the weeds on the details.
What do you think of the TikTok service as a real competitor long-term to other social media companies like Insta?
I think there is no question that every company gets disrupted. Every company. It doesn't matter how cool you are in the current moment. It doesn't matter how hard you work to not get disrupted. Every company gets disrupted. And you have to stay alive by looking out for the next version, because typically what happens is a company that looks odd and looks a little strange, I don't know, disappearing photos, it's kind of a strange thing, comes along and you kind of ignore it, and then all of a sudden, it's really big because they decide, you know what, we're not just gonna stick with our little niche over here, we're gonna expand. So I don't know if it's TikTok because I'm not a fortune teller, but there's gonna be someone who comes along and challenges Instagram and challenges Facebook. And I think that's healthy. That keeps these teams working hard, and I think that's part of innovation. You have to have competitors in order to What
do you make of Snap right now?
Just in general?
Do you think that Snap is reemerging? There's a view that Snap may be reemerging.
Well, I mean, I think that view is supported by a stock price, and right. I think the question is whether or not it's supported by engagement metrics, whether or not, if you go on the street, like how many people do you see using Instagram or Facebook or Snap or TikTok, and what is the relative what are the relative usages of those services? I think that we have a moment in time where you have Facebook, which is tied up in a lot of controversy, and they're trying to figure out their path forward. Instagram went through an enormous transition where effectively the entire leadership turned over, and you have these companies on the outside now vying for a position. I think it's going to be really interesting to watch the next year. I'm just not in the game.
Okay. While you're out of the game, before we let you go, tell us what you're going to do next.
No, I'm not going to tell you.
Do you have? Hold on. Do you know?
I don't know yet. What I will say.
How are you thinking about it then?
Yeah, exactly. I'll tell you how I'm thinking about it. Well, first off, Instagram wasn't like I woke up one day and said, I have this vision. We're going to build this, this, and this. No, it was a bunch of failures, like time after time. And slowly we learned from those failures, and we said, hey, what actually works? What doesn't work? Can we debug that? Oh, okay, go a little bit more in that direction. And we found ourselves honing in on this idea of sharing photos on your mobile phone, and even filters weren't included in the first version. We had to figure our way out there. There's no moment a company starts. It's this messy process of failure, and I'm currently in that messy process of failure. And every now and then I get on stage and talk.
Kevin Systrom, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.